Montana Territory, early spring of 1883, and the wind was raising dust like ghosts across the train platform in Miles City. Ruth Delaney's gloved hands slipped on the leather handle of her trunk as she tried to drag it down the steps of the passenger car. Another gust caught her skirts, tangled them around her boots, and nearly toppled her sideways. She bit down on the edge of a curse and yanked harder. "Let me carry more than that," a voice said behind her, low, steady, and warm as a campfire on a cold night. Ruth turned fast, startled enough to lose her grip. The trunk thudded onto the planks with a solid thump. A tall man in a worn trail coat and dusty boots stepped forward and bent to lift it like it weighed nothing. His hat shadowed most of his face, but she caught a glimpse of fair hair, square jaw, and eyes the color of still water. "I thank you," Ruth said, catching her breath. "Name's Waylon Brooks," he said, not even winded. "You heading into town or beyond?" "Miles City," she said, brushing her skirts smooth. "I'm taking over the school. Miss Penner passed last month," Waylon nodded, shifting the trunk with practiced ease. "My ranch is 15 miles north. I come into town for supplies every few weeks." "Saw you struggling and figured I could spare a hand." Ruth studied him. He looked around 30, maybe a year or two more. No ring. No sign of a woman's touch on his clothes or manner, just a cowboy with calloused hands and good manners. "I appreciate the help," she said, her voice softening. "I can manage from here." "Not a chance," Waylon said, already walking toward the boardwalk where a wagon waited. "You look like you have not slept in a week, and this trunk might dent the sidewalk if you try dragging it again." Ruth followed, her cheeks warming. "You always this forward with strangers." "Only when they are about to wrench their arm trying to prove they do not need help," he said as he heaved the trunk into the back of the wagon. Then he turned and offered his hand. "You got a place to stay?" "Boarding house on Main," she said, taking his hand. It was warm, rough, and strong. He helped her up into the wagon like she weighed nothing at all. "You mind if I give you a ride over?" he asked, settling beside her on the bench. "Not at all," Ruth said, stealing a glance at him, "but I can pay you for your trouble." "No trouble," Waylon said. "I meant it when I said I want to carry more than just your trunk." Ruth's breath caught. He looked at her then, really looked. "You came all this way alone. That tells me a lot." "I do not know what brought you here, but I reckon it costs something. Folks do not cross half the country unless they are leaving something behind." Ruth turned her eyes forward, hands clenched in her lap. "I was teaching in Missouri. My father passed last fall. After the funeral, there was not much left for me there." "You got people here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Just this job, and whatever comes after." Waylon nodded, silent for a moment as the wagon rolled down the muddy street. Then he said, "Well, you got a friend now. And a good one." She looked at him again, surprised by the way her chest loosened at those words. The boarding house was a 2-story clapboard house with lace curtains and a whitewashed porch. Waylon lifted the trunk again and carried it inside like it was made of feathers. The landlady, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Kessler, met them at the door. "You must be the new schoolmarm," she said, handing Ruth a key. "Room is upstairs. Supper at 6 sharp. No men upstairs after dark." Waylon grinned at that and tipped his hat. "Understood, ma'am." Ruth followed him up the narrow stairs. He set the trunk gently by the bed and straightened. "I will be around," he said. "If you need anything, you can ask." "I will," she said, then hesitated. "Thank you again, I mean it." He nodded once, his eyes lingering on hers. Then he turned and left. Ruth stood there long after he was gone, her heart racing for the first time in months. She saw him again 3 days later. He was waiting outside the schoolhouse with a small wooden crate in his arms. "Brought you some things," he said. Inside were a stack of slates, 2 bottles of ink, a handful of pencils, and a thick wool shawl. Figured the mornings might be cold in here until the stove warms up. Ruth blinked hard. Waylon. I know it is not much, he said, looking sheepish. It is, she said. It is more than I expected. The kids arrived soon after, and he tipped his hat, gave her a look that lingered, and walked off. Weeks passed. Waylon came into town more often, always with some small reason. A sack of flour, a new bridle, a short visit to the general store that ended with him walking her home from the schoolhouse. They talked more. About her father's illness. About his ranch, which he had built from scratch with his brother, who had died in a stampede 5 years ago. About the loneliness that hung around both of them like smoke from a long, dead fire. He never pushed, never crossed lines, but he was always there. One night near the end of April, she stepped out of the schoolhouse and found him waiting with his horse tied nearby. I was wondering, he said, voice low, if you might come out to the ranch this weekend. If you are free, I've got a new foal I think you would like. Ruth hesitated, her heart thudding. I would like that very much. He smiled slow, real, and held out his hand. She took it, just for a moment. But it felt like the start of something solid. That weekend, she rode out with him at dawn. The ranch was quiet, tucked between 2 hills, with a wide pasture stretching behind the house. He showed her the foal, a spindly-legged thing that nosed her hand. Waylon watched her the whole time, eyes soft. Later they sat on the porch, drinking coffee while the sun dipped low. You know, he said, I meant what I said that first day. I want to carry more than just your trunk. Ruth turned to face him. You barely knew me then. I knew enough, he said. I saw a woman standing on her own, fighting to hold up a life that had gotten too heavy, and I wanted to help. She swallowed hard. You have helped. I want to keep helping, he said. If you will let me. Ruth reached out, took his hand in both of hers. Yes, she said. I want that too. And in the quiet that followed, with the sky turning gold behind them, they sat together, fingers laced, hearts steady on the edge of something good. By the time Ruth stepped off Waylon's wagon after the ride back from his ranch, the air had warmed enough to carry the smell of lilac from the bushes trailing along the edge of the boarding house. She adjusted her bonnet with one hand, the other still tingling from where his fingers had brushed hers earlier while handing her down. He didn't linger, just tipped his head, not quite a nod, not quite a goodbye, and turned the team around without another word. Ruth watched the wagon disappear up the street, then climbed the steps to her room. She hung her shawl on the hook behind the door, took off her boots, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. The small room was quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Kessler let her borrow after the first week, when Ruth kept arriving late for supper. That felt like a lifetime ago now. The next afternoon, she stayed late at the schoolhouse, working by lamplight while the boys stacked chairs and the girls swept the floor. The spelling lesson had gone poorly. Elias Cray had torn his page in half out of frustration, and Sarah Loring had cried when Ruth corrected her pronunciation too sharply. She'd spent the hour after dismissal writing out new word lists by hand, careful to soften the difficulty without losing the challenge. She was locking up when a voice called from the road. You always work this late. She turned. Waylon sat atop a chestnut gelding, reins loose in one hand, the other resting on his thigh. He was squinting into the setting sun, his coat collar turned up against the breeze. I don't always have a choice, she said. Some lessons take more tending than others. He dismounted in one fluid motion, tying the horse to the post near the gate. I brought you something, she frowned. You really don't need to keep bringing things. This one's not from me, he said, lifting a cloth-wrapped bundle from the saddlebag. It's from my neighbor, Widow Allen. She heard about you coming to teach and sent biscuits. Said the town's owed a real school again since her nephew got kicked by a mule trying to learn his letters. Ruth tried not to smile and failed. How is he now? Still can't spell mule, but he walks straight again. She took the bundle from him, the warmth of it seeping through the cloth. Thank her for me. I will. She wants to meet you. Ruth's eyebrows rose. Why? Because she's nosy, Wayland said. And because she heard I rode into town 3 times last week. That silenced her. She looked away, then down at the bundle in her hands. He stepped a little closer. You can say no. I'd understand. I don't want to say no, she said, quiet. I'm just still figuring out what yes means. Wayland didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the fields where the grass was just starting to green again after the long winter. My mother used to say nothing grows right if it's rushed, he said at last. Especially not trust. Ruth nodded slowly. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, he said. Hard, too, grew up in a dugout with 5 brothers. She didn't believe in soft things. But she believed in lasting ones. The wind tugged a strand of hair loose from Ruth's braid, and she tucked it back behind her ear. I suppose I've had enough of soft things that fell apart, she said. Then let's build something that doesn't, he said. They stood in silence after that. Not the kind that asked for more words, but the kind that settled between them like a shared blanket, quiet, warm, and sure. Well, she said finally, lifting the bundle, I should get these home before they go cold. I'll walk you, Wayland said. She didn't argue. They moved down the road side by side, boots crunching lightly over the dry dirt. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the clapboard fences and empty yards. A dog barked once in the distance, but otherwise the town was winding down. Do you miss Missouri? Wayland asked after a while. No, she said. I miss what I thought it was, but not what it turned out to be. He waited, but she didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Some things didn't bear repeating. You ever think about leaving here? She asked instead. Used to, he said. After my brother died, I thought I'd sell the place, go south, start fresh somewhere nobody knew my name. What changed? He looked at her, not away. Didn't want to run anymore. They reached the boarding house steps. Ruth rested a hand on the railing, then turned to face him. You said something once, she said, about carrying more than just a trunk. He met her eyes steady. I remember. I've been carrying things alone a long time, she said. I'm not sure I know how to share the weight. Then we'll learn slow, Wayland said. Together. Ruth nodded once, then opened the door and stepped inside. Behind her, the sound of his boots on the walk receded, steady and unhurried, like a man with time. By mid-May, the cottonwoods along the Tongue River had leafed out thick and green, their fluttering shadows dancing across the schoolhouse walls during the long afternoon lessons. Ruth had taken to leaving the windows open when the breeze was mild, chalk dust swirling up and out as she moved between the slates and ink wells, her voice even and sure. On Friday, just after the final bell, a knock came at the back door of the school. She just finished wiping the board clean and turned, startled, to find Wayland standing on the stoop with a rolled sheet of paper in his hand. I didn't want to interrupt, he said, offering it forward. Thought you might want this for your classroom. Found it in a chest tucked up in my attic. She took it carefully, unrolling it to reveal a hand-drawn map of the Montana Territory, yellowed but readable, the rivers and mountain ranges inked in precise lines. It's beautiful, she said, tracing the curve of the Yellowstone River with her fingertip. It's old, he said. From when the Army first started mapping the region. My father had it framed once back in the early days, before the house burned. She looked up. You never mentioned a fire. No reason to before now, he replied, voice quiet. It was a long time ago. My brother and I were boys. Lightning struck the roof one night during a storm, took the house and most of what was inside. We rebuilt, but some things never came back. Ruth gently rolled the map again and set it on the desk. "It means a great deal that you'd bring this here. You're building something in this room," he said. "Thought it might help to know where it sits in the world." She met his gaze, then nodded. "It will." He hesitated, then asked, "You doing anything tomorrow?" Ruth dusted her palms together and straightened a stack of readers. "I hadn't planned to. There's a fair over in Rosebud. Folks from all around bring their stock and wares. I thought maybe you'd like to ride out with me." "It's not too far." She considered him for a moment. "You think I'm ready to meet half the county?" "I think you've already made your mark on this town," he said. "Might as well let the rest of them see what Miles City already knows." That drew a smile from her. "All right. I'll come." The next morning, Ruth wore her blue calico and the bonnet with the faded ribbon. Not her finest, but neat and clean. Waylon arrived with a two-seated buggy instead of his saddle horse, the seat freshly dusted and a blanket laid over the back in case of wind. His shirt was pressed, collar starched, and he'd shaved close for the first time she could remember. They rode in companionable silence for the first stretch, the road running between stretches of open land still wet from spring melt. At one point, a hawk flew overhead, casting a long shadow across the grass. "I never asked what made you take up teaching," Waylon said at last, eyes on the road ahead. "My mother taught me to read by lamplight," Ruth said. "She passed when I was 12. After that, I started teaching my younger cousins. It gave the days shape, made them feel less hollow. You could have done something else." "I didn't want to," she said. "I like the quiet work of it, the way a child's eyes light when they understand something for the first time." Waylon nodded. "I get that. There's something about watching a thing grow because you put your hands to it." They reached the edge of Rosebud by mid-morning. The fair spread across the meadow just east of the river, tents and wagons arranged in a rough circle. Children darted between booths selling seed corn and hand-dyed cloth. The air smelled of sweet bread, horses, and pipe smoke. Waylon guided the buggy to a spot near a line of cottonwoods, tied the reins, and offered his hand. Ruth stepped down, her boots sinking slightly into the turned earth. As they walked the rows, a few heads turned, eyes following Waylon with recognition, then flicking to Ruth with polite interest. She met each glance without flinching. They stopped at a booth selling hand-carved buttons, and Ruth ran her fingers over a row of cedar ones shaped like stars. Waylon stood behind her quiet until she chose two and handed over her coin. "You didn't need to buy anything," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. "It feels good to choose something just because it pleases me." They shared a meal at a long table near the edge of the grounds, roast pork with beans and a hard biscuit that softened only after a long soak in molasses. He handed her the tin cup first, and she passed it back with a small smile. Later, as the sun dipped and the shadows stretched long, they walked down by the riverbank, away from the fair. The current moved slow and thick, carrying branches and bits of grass downstream. Birds called from the trees overhead, and the wind stirred the hem of Ruth's dress. "I used to think I'd live quiet and alone," she said. "Not in a sad way, just steady, safe." Waylon bent to pick up a stone, thumbed it once, then let it fall. "And now," she looked at him, "now I don't know what comes next. But I don't think I want to face it alone anymore." He reached for her hand, slow and sure. "We could make a life out here, one built careful, real." Ruth drew in a breath, then let it out. "Yes, I want that, with you." He squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll start there." The river kept on flowing, and above them, the sky deepened into the first blue of evening. They stood together on the bank, not speaking, not needing to, just letting the quiet settle around them like something earned. And this time, neither of them let go. The first rain of June came with little warning, just a sudden hush to the wind, and a thickening of the air that made the horses restless, and the children fidget in their seats. Ruth barely had time to shutter the windows of the schoolhouse before the clouds broke open. The storm swept across Miles City in waves, flattening the grass and drumming hard against the roof. When dismissal came, most of the younger students had already been fetched by their fathers in slickers or older siblings with borrowed shawls. Ruth lingered, setting aside the damp readers and wiping down the slates before locking the door against the rising wind. She pulled her oilcloth cloak tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the road, the hem of her dress soaking through within seconds. At the corner near the blacksmith's, a wagon waited. Not Waylon's usual team, but his, plain enough the reins held steady in his hands, his hat pulled low, the brim dripping. "Get in," he said. "You'll catch your death walking." She climbed up without protest, water sluicing down her sleeves. He passed her a folded blanket from the seat. "I should have brought another coat," she said, bundling it across her lap. "I thought you might be stubborn," he said. "Didn't want to risk you waving me off if I showed up dressed for courting." She looked over, rain clinging to her lashes. "Is that what this is?" He gave a quiet shrug. "It's not that." The wagon wheels clattered over the slick boards of the bridge, the river below swollen and swift. Ruth glanced toward the rising current. "Last time the water got this high," she said, "the Grange Hall flooded clean through." "That was 3 years back," Waylon said. "We spent a week hauling hay bales out of the mud." "You stayed to help then?" she asked. Didn't seem right to ride off while folks were still bailing out their lives. She turned to him. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't stayed?" "Sometimes," he said. "But most days, I'm just working at being better than I was a year ago." A man can spend his whole life chasing somewhere else and never build anything that keeps. The road turned muddy outside town, and the horses slowed to keep their footing. Waylon leaned forward, speaking low to them, his voice steady. Ruth watched the way his hand moved over the reins, gentle, sure, like he meant to guide, not force. They stopped at the livery to shelter the team. Waylon unhitched in the downpour without complaint, his coat soaked through, sleeves heavy with water. Ruth stepped into the barn ahead of him, the scent of wet hay and leather thick in the air. "I won't be long," he said, rubbing the mare's neck. "She spooks if I leave her wet too long." Ruth hung back near the stalls, watching the rain beat against the tin roof. "You ever think about building a home closer to town?" He paused, brushing water from his brow. "I've thought about what it would take to make room for someone else out there, thought about what needs mending, what should be cleared." "You do all that." "I've already started," he said. Had the back wall of the lean-to taken down, figured it could be turned into a kitchen with the right boards. She stepped closer. "What made you decide?" "You," he said simply. The rain slowed, the sound of it softening into a steady patter. Ruth looked at him, his hair darkened with water, his hands rough with work, and felt something settle in her chest, quiet and deep. "I never asked," she said. "What you want, not from me, just in general." "I want a life that holds," he said. "One that doesn't break when the weather turns or the world gets mean. I want a fire that stays lit even when the roof leaks. I want someone to sit beside me who doesn't flinch when it gets hard." She reached out, took his hand where it rested on the stall door. "You already have that." His fingers tightened around hers. "Then let me give back what you've given me. Let me build something that lasts under your name, too." Outside, the storm began to pass, leaving puddles that glistened in the low light. Ruth stepped into the open doorway, the air clean and sharp, and turned back toward him. "I'll come out this Sunday," she said. "I want to see the kitchen you've started." He smiled, not wide, just enough for her to feel it take root somewhere steady. "I'll cook," he said. "Don't expect much. But it'll be honest." "That's all I've ever wanted," she said. They walked back toward town together, the wind gentler now, their steps easy and matched. No burden between them, only what they chose to carry. Together. Ruth arrived at the ranch just as the morning sun crested the ridge, casting long shadows across the pasture. The ride out had been quiet, the kind of stillness that didn't weigh heavy but settled easy in the chest. When she reached the yard, she found Waylon already waiting near the gate, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a half-built frame of rough-hewn boards rising from the rear wall of the house. "You made good time," he said, straightening from where he'd been fitting a crossbeam. "I borrowed Mrs. Kessler's gelding," she said. "He's got more ambition than sense, but he moves fast." Waylon chuckled, wiping his hands with a cloth. "You want to see it?" She nodded, and he led her around to the back where the lean-to had been torn down to the studs. New boards had gone up, the scent of fresh pine sharp in the warming air. Sawdust clung to the edges of the porch. "It'll be small," he said, "but there'll be a window over the basin. I figured you'd want light when you're working dough or washing up." Ruth stepped inside the frame, imagining the space filled in. "You thought about where the stove'll go," he pointed to the far wall. "Corner there. I've got a cast iron one I've been saving. My brother traded for it just before." He stopped, the words catching for a breath, then continued. "Before the spring he passed, I never used it, always felt like it belonged to more than just me." She rested a hand on the beam nearest her. "Maybe it still does. Just in a new way now." They stood there a moment, quiet and steady, then she turned to him. "How long will the work take?" "Few weeks, maybe more if the weather turns." He glanced at the sky. "But I'll finish it." "I know you will." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable for a beat. "Then, I've been thinking about what comes after it's built." She waited. "I want this place to carry your name too," he said. "Not just in the kitchen or the porch, I mean all of it. House, land, me." Ruth held his gaze. "You mean marriage?" He nodded once. "I do. I'll wait if you need time, but I want you to know that's where I'm headed." She stepped closer, her voice low. "When I left Missouri, I didn't think I'd ever want to belong anywhere again, but I do, here, with you." Waylon reached for her hand. "So you'll marry me?" "Yes." His breath caught just slightly, and then he pulled her into a firm embrace, one hand braced at her back. "You've changed everything," he murmured. "No," she said into his shoulder. "You just made it safe to begin again." They spent the rest of the day side by side. Ruth helped carry planks while Waylon hammered them in. She fetched nails, held beams steady, and once, when he nicked his knuckle, she tore a strip from the inside lining of her skirt and wrapped his hand without needing to be asked. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. When the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long again, they sat together on the front porch. The horses grazed quietly beyond the fence line. The kitchen frame stood behind them, sturdy and promising. "You know when you'd want to marry?" he asked. "I'd like it to be here," she said. "Plain ceremony, nothing grand." "I know the parson in town," he said. "He comes out this way sometimes. I could send word tomorrow." She took his hand. "Then let's not wait." They married the following Sunday, with the parson standing just beyond the porch steps and a handful of neighbors gathered in the yard. Widow Allen brought a loaf of sweet bread wrapped in a cloth too fine for everyday use. The Cray boy fidgeted through the whole thing, but Sarah Loring stood still and serious at Ruth's side, holding the bouquet she'd picked herself from the hills near the river. Mrs. Kessler came too. She didn't say much, but when Ruth hugged her afterward, the older woman pressed something small into her palm, a silver thimble. "For your new mending box," she said, and left it at that. That evening, when the guests had gone and the lanterns burned low, Ruth stood at the edge of the half-finished kitchen, her hand resting on the frame. "You know," she said, "I think this place will hold." Waylon stepped behind her, arms sliding around her waist. It already does. They spent the night in the small bedroom off the front room, the windows open to let in the scent of prairie grass and wood smoke. They moved slow, with the care of people who'd known loss and didn't intend to take love for granted. They learned each other's silences, each other's breath. In the weeks that followed, the kitchen was finished and painted pale cream inside. Ruth planted herbs in a row of clay pots along the windowsill. Waylon built a coop for the hens she insisted on keeping, even if they pecked at her boots. They rose early, worked side by side, and came in together each evening, hands dusted with flour or dirt or sawdust. Ruth stayed on at the schoolhouse through the end of the term, walking into town each morning and riding back in the afternoons. On Sundays, Waylon sometimes came with her, sitting in the back row while she led the children through their lessons and hymns. He didn't sing, but he listened, and when she turned to dismiss the class, he was always watching her. They never spoke of the past other than when it rose naturally. Grief didn't vanish, but it softened, no longer the sharp edge it once was. They made a new story quiet, steady, theirs. Years passed. The school grew. So did the ranch. Ruth's hair silvered at the temples, and Waylon's back grew tighter from long days of work, but their hands still found each other each night. They held fast through dry seasons and cold winters, through the small sorrows and the great joys. And every year, on the morning after the first June rain, Ruth would wake early, step barefoot into the kitchen light, and pause by the window above the basin, the one he'd framed just for her. He always found her there, arms folded, eyes on the land they'd built together. And without fail, he'd wrap his arms around her and say, "Still holding." And Ruth would smile, lean back into him, and answer, "Always."